A broad ray of light fell into the garret and showed the workman, with an unfinished shoe upon his lap, pausing in his labour. His few common tools and various scraps of leather were at his feet and on his bench. He had a white beard, raggedly cut, but not very long, a hollow face, and exceedingly bright eyes. The hollowness and thinness of his face would have caused them to look large under his yet dark eyebrows and his confused white hair, though they had been really otherwise. But they were naturally large and looked unnaturally so. His yellow rags of shirt lay open at the throat and showed his body to be withered and worn. He and his old canvas frock and his loose stockings and all his poor tatters of clothes had, in long seclusion from direct light and air, faded down to such a dull uniformity of parchment yellow that it would have been hard to say which was which. He had put up a hand between his eyes and the light, and the very bones of it seemed transparent. So he sat, with a steadfastly vacant gaze, pausing in his work. He never looked at the figure before him without first looking down on this side of himself, then on that, as if he had lost the habit of associating place with sound. He never spoke without first wandering in this manner and forgetting to speak. "Are you going to finish that pair of shoes today?" asked Defarge, motioning to Mr. Lorry to come forward. "What did you say?" "Do you mean to finish that pair of shoes today?" "I can't say that I mean to. I suppose so. I don't know." But the question reminded him of his work, and he bent over it again. Mr. Lorry came silently forward, leaving the daughter by the door. When he stood for a minute or two by the side of Defarge, the shoemaker looked up. He showed no surprise at seeing another figure, but the unsteady fingers of one of his hands strayed to his lips as he looked at it. His lips and his nails were of the same pale lead colour. And then the hand dropped to his work, and he once more bent over his shoe. The look and the action had occupied but an instant. "You have a visitor, you see," said Monsieur Defarge. "What did you say?" "Here is a visitor." The shoemaker looked up as before, but without removing a hand from his work. "Come," said Defarge. "Here is Monsieur, who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one. Show him that shoe you are working at. Take it, Monsieur." Mr. Lorry took it in his hand. "Tell Monsieur what kind of shoe it is, and the maker's name." There was a longer pause than usual before the shoemaker replied. "I forget what it was you asked me. What did you say?" "I said, couldn't you describe the kind of shoe for Monsieur's information?" "It is a lady's shoe. It is a young lady's walking shoe. It is in the present mode. I never saw the mode. I have had a pattern in my hand." He glanced at the shoe with some little passing touch of pride. "And the maker's name?" said Defarge. Now that he had no work to hold, he laid the knuckles of the right hand in the hollow of the left, and then the knuckles of the left hand in the hollow of the right, and then passed a hand across his bearded chin, and so on in regular changes without a moment's intermission. The task of recalling him from the vacancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavouring, in the hope of some disclosure, to stay the spirit of a fast-dying man. "Did you ask me my name?" "Assuredly I did." 105 North Tower. "Is that all?" 105 North Tower. With a weary sound that was not a sigh nor a groan, he bent to work again until the silence was again broken. "You are not a shoemaker by trade," said Mr. Lorry, looking steadfastly at him. His haggard eyes turned to Defarge, as if he would have transferred the question to him, but as no help came from that quarter, they turned back on the questioner when they had sought the ground. "I am not a shoemaker by trade. No, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learnt it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to..." He lapsed away, even for minutes, ringing those measured changes on his hands the whole time. His eyes came slowly back, at last, to the face from which they had wandered. When they rested on it, he started, and resumed, in the manner of a sleeper, that moment awake, reverting to a subject of last night. "I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty. With much difficulty after a long while, and I have made shoes ever since." As he held out his hand for the shoe that had been taken from him, Mr. Lorry said, still looking steadfastly in his face, "Monsieur Manette, do you remember nothing of me?" The shoe dropped to the ground, and he sat looking fixedly at the questioner. "Monsieur Manette," Mr. Lorry laid his hand upon Defarge's arm, "do you remember nothing of this man? Look at him. Look at me. Is there no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manette?" As the captive of many years sat looking fixedly by turns at Mr. Lorry and at Defarge, some long obliterated marks of an actively intent intelligence in the middle of the forehead gradually forced themselves through the black mist that had fallen on him. They were overclouded again. They were fainter. They were gone. But they had been there. And so exactly was the expression repeated on the fair young face of her who had crept along the wall to a point where she could see him, and where she now stood looking at him, with hands which at first had been only raised in frightened compassion, if not even to keep him off and shut out the sight of him, but which were now extending towards him, trembling with eagerness to lay the spectral face upon her breast and love it back to life and hope. So exactly was the expression repeated, though in stronger characters, on her fair young face, that it looked as though it had passed like a moving light from him to her. Darkness had fallen on him in its place. He looked at the two, less and less attentively, and his eyes in gloomy abstraction sought the ground and looked about him in the old way. Finally, with a deep, long sigh, he took the shoe up and resumed his work. "Have you recognized him, monsieur?" asked Defarge in a whisper. "Yes. For a moment. At first I thought it quite hopeless, but I have unquestionably seen, for a single moment, the face that I once knew so well. Hush. Let us draw further back. Hush." She had moved from the wall of the garret, very near to the bench on which he sat. There was something awful in his unconsciousness of the figure that could have put out its hand and touched him as he stooped over his labor. Not a word was spoken, not a sound was made. She stood like a spirit beside him, and he bent over his work. It happened, at length, that he had occasion to change the instrument in his hand for his shoemaker's knife. It lay on the side of him. It lay on that side of him, which was not the side on which he stood. He had taken it up and was stooping to work again when his eyes caught the skirt of her dress. He raised them and saw her face. The two spectators started forward, but she stayed them with a motion of her hand. She had no fear of his striking at her with the knife, though they had. He stared at her with a fearful look, and after a while his lips began to form some words, though no sound proceeded from them.
Now let's do the question answer. Who was Mr. Lorry? What did he visit? Why did he visit the shoemaker? Mr. Lorry was perhaps someone known to Mr. Manet. He could have been his banker or his servant suggested in this chapter. Next question पे चलते हैं. What was the reason behind Mr. Lorry accompanying Lucy to the prisoner? The reason behind Mr. Lorry accompanying Lucy to the prison was to reunite Lucy and her father. Next question. Who was Monsieur Manet and why was he in prison? Monsieur Manet is actually the old shoemaker's name. Maybe due to some conspiracy or lack of evidence, Monsieur Manet was imprisoned. Describe the shoemaker as the lady saw him. He had a white beard, raggedly cut but not very long, a hollow face and exceedingly bright eyes. The hollowness and thinness of his face would have caused them to look large under his jet dark eyebrows and his confused white hair, though they had been really otherwise. But they were naturally large and thus looked unnaturally so. His yellow rags of shirt. Why did Shoemaker not invoke a feeling of fear in the girl? The girl was the shoemaker's daughter. She had seen signs of faint recognition in the shoemaker's face as he spoke to Mr. Lorry and Mr. Defarge, and also some signs of an active intelligence. All she felt was strong for love and wished to nurse him back to life and hope. She was not at all scared of him and knew he would not hurt her. Do you think Mr. Lorry knew Monsieur Manet? If yes, how? Mr. Lorry did know Mr. Manet as he mentioned old times to him. He was perhaps his banker or an old associate. He had accompanied his daughter Lucy with the purpose of recognizing the captive as Mr. Manet, which he could have done only if he knew him. Hush, let us draw further back. Hush, why do you think Mr. Lorry said these words? Mr. Lorry wanted Lucy to have an uninterrupted private moment with her father. Perhaps the deep bond of filial love would be able to evoke some response from Mr. Manet. Lucy too could embrace him and give him hope. I hope you find them useful. Thank you for watching.